Good evening. All right, I see some repeat offenders. That is all right. That is all right. Thank you so much for coming back. I hear a little person. Welcome, welcome, welcome. But we are going to go ahead and get started. I was just sharing with Dr. Berry how pleased I was last night to look back about 10 or 15 minutes into the lecture to see that folk came on out. And it was a good night last night. We're looking forward to all that we will be hearing. Come on in, Brother Mosley. And can we close these doors over here? Last night, we had Dr. Robert Pratt, who talked to us about some lesser-known figures of the civil rights movement. And from all of our perspective, they were really lesser known, right? Because there was only a handful of them that we even recognized. But what a powerful presentation we got last night. Tonight, we have Dr. Stephen Berry, who is a colleague, or they are colleagues. He and Dr. Pratt are colleagues in the history department at UGA. And I had the distinct privilege of sitting in his Civil War class 2 falls ago. And I was so impressed with the depth and the breadth of his, not just his knowledge, but the engagement that he displayed with all of the stuff that he is researching and writing on. Has written 5 books. I hear a little person. Five books, and he's going to talk to us about one that he sent me about a year and a half ago. One of the drafts of it, and I borrowed some of it for a paper I had to write. But I was so thrilled to be in his class that I took an independent study class with him the following semester, and it has enriched me. So I'm going to step aside now so that he can come in his own special way. So won't you put your hands together for Dr. Stephen Berry. He talked to us about some lesser known.
Well, thank you all so much for coming out. I want to thank Reverend Bledsoe, also all of the organizers for inviting me. If we can hit one slide.
There was only a handful of them that we even recognized, but what a powerful presentation we
can do it without slides.
Tonight, we have Dr. Stephen Berry, who is a colleague, or they are colleagues. He and Dr.
Well, it's okay. One of the things I wanted to talk about is what an honor it is to be here to talk on in Black History Month. We all know the history that stretches all the way back to 1926, the pioneering Black historian, the father of Black history, Carter Woodson. Of course, he created Black History Month. He founded ASALH, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. He founded the first academic journal devoted to Black history. And he didn't just want Black history to be taught to Black people. He wanted all people to recognize the contributions that Blacks had made to our history. That was his important contribution. And so I want to talk about the animating spirit that brings us here tonight during Black History Month. He has a quotation that I adore. Real education, he says, means to inspire people to live more abundantly, to learn to begin with life as they find it, and make it better. No man knows what he can do until he tries. No man knows what he can do until he tries. I'm going to tell you a story of such a man today. I'm going to tell you the story of the most consequential American about whom Americans know nothing. Mark these words: when a historian says the most, the best, the anything, they better bring their game. They better be able to back that up. By the time we're done talking tonight, I hope I've convinced you that this man's name will be in everyone's mouth right soon. So, the story I want to tell is the story of Prince Rivers. Prince Rivers was born enslaved. We don't even know when. He has in 1870 census gives his birth age as 45 years old. So we think that he would have been born around 1825. Certainly didn't know his birthday. Didn't know his father. We have guesses about who his mother was. We don't know that either. He might not have either. So you have to start from a position where you don't know when you were born, you don't know who your mother is, you don't know who your father is. And then imagine overcoming all of that to do what he did.
So I want to talk about the animating spirit.
If we can advance the slide.
Here tonight.
Awesome. So there he is. This is the only picture we have of him.
He has a quotation.
And the
that I
reason
wrote.
that no one knows
Real
him
education
is because he left
means to
no
inspire
papers.
people to live more
All that he ever
abundantly,
wrote, all that
learn to
we
begin
know
with
that he
life
said,
as they find it,
if you wrote it down,
make
it
it
would
better.
be less than one
No man
sheet of
knows
paper,
what he can do
right?
until he
So he
tries.
left no archive in
No
the
man knows
historical
what he can do
sense,
until he tries.
right? Papers
I'm
in a
gonna tell
marble
you the
monument,
story
usually
of
to
such a
elite
man
white
today.
families. He didn't leave
I'm
that
going
kind
to
of
tell you
archive.
the story of the
He
most
left an archive
consequential
of
American
action.
about whom
We
Americans
are
know
all,
nothing.
no more or less
Mark these
than
words
what we
when the
do.
historian says
He was a man of
the
action.
most,
He left
the
an
best,
archive of action,
the
and it's from
anything.
that
They better bring
archive
their game.
that I'm
They
going to
better be able
read
to back that up.
his
By
history
the time
tonight.
we're done talking tonight,
What we do know about him,
I've convinced you that this man's
he
name
was
will be every
born
one's
enslaved
mouth
to Henry Middleton
right
Stewart. He
soon.
was a coachman. So
the story
if
I
you
wanna
can
tell,
imagine what that
is
meant,
the story of
you are
Prince
constantly
Rivers.
driving other people to their
Prince Rivers was born
destinies.
enslaved. We don't
right?
even know when.
He
has in
can,
1870
he knows
census
everything
gives his
about the
birth,
lay of the land, the
age is
geography that they're
45
living
years
in,
old.
but
So we think that he
can't go anywhere freely himself. How enormously frustrating that must have been.
Didn't know his
You're the
father.
human GPS. There's a reason Mark Twain made as much money as he did.
We don't
right?
know that either.
Today,
He
my
might
students
not have
probably
either.
can't get from their car to the classroom without GPS. For an enslaved person to know the geography of an entire state so perfectly, but not to be able to go anywhere, to always be ferrying other people to their destinies. That's what he did until in 1861, the Union Army is establishing anchorage points in South Carolina. In the Battle of Port Royal in November 1861, all of those white enslaving families flee inward. Prince Rivers, as the coachman for this family, carried that family to the interior, to Edgefield, South Carolina, jumped on that carriage horse, rode it all the way back. He became the tip of the black spear, the first of the first of the first. We are not near yet the United States colored troops, which aren't formed until the summer of 1863. We're talking November 1861. He might have been the first black man in Union uniform organized in Port Royal. Then you have to imagine his role. He is Color Sergeant, Company A, 1st South Carolina Volunteers. It makes him the first of the first of the first. Can we advance the slide a few? One more. And again. So, in 1861, Rivers is interviewed by a reporter, and the reporters ask the most obtuse question I think a typical white reporter might ask: why haven't the slaves risen en masse before now? And Rivers tells, are you insane? Denmark Vesey tried it. Nat Turner tried it. John Brown tried it. And all it won them is murder and mayhem for them and their families. It was insane to try. He has what the French call the coup d'oeil, the sweep of the eye. That means you can see a battle, how it's going to play out before it ever starts. He has that for politics. He's 37 years old. He could drive anywhere at any time. He could have broke for freedom at any time. Why bother? It's not yet now. But the second it was now, he was gone with the wind, right? And he told them that. What would have been the use? We would have no chance, no gun, no sword, no chance, no nothing. So the reporter then says, well, suppose he did have a chance, would you all fight then? Yes, I know we would. Only let us know for sure, mind you, that the white people mean right. Let us know for sure that we're fighting for ourselves, and I know we'll fight. Advance, please. The reporter continues, well, Prince, wouldn't you call this a good chance? And he says, yes, sir, I do. And I tell my people this may be our last chance. This is our time. If our fathers had had such a chance as this, we should not have been slaves now. If we do not improve this chance, another one will not come, and our children will be slaves always. This is the coup d'oeil, the sweep of the eye. He has a notion about how time works. Every once in a while, time becomes elastic. The impossible becomes possible, then probable, then inevitable. And then time locks down. This was a moment of plasticity, a moment of possibility. And he's going to make the most of that moment. Slide. Rivers' commander was Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Remember, Rivers is the first of the first of the first. He's the highest ranking black member in the 1st South Carolina, and probably in the Union Army. This is what his commander says of him: "There is not a white officer in this regiment who has more administrative ability or more absolute authority over the men. He is jet black and very handsome, with a figure superior to that of any of our white officers, being 6 feet high, perfectly proportioned, and of apparently inexhaustible strength and activity. His gait is like a panther's. I never saw such a tread. No anti-slavery novel has described a man of such marked ability. If his education had achieved a slightly higher point, I see no reason why he should not command the Army of the Potomac." The Army of the Potomac could have used him, I can absolutely tell you that. If there should ever be a black monarchy in South Carolina, he will be its king. That is a measure of respect. That is the measure of a man. He saw the kind of potential in Rivers that you will see play out. Next slide. So here's the thing to understand about the 1st South Carolina. I understand you haven't maybe heard of the 1st South Carolina, that haven't heard of their exploits, haven't heard of Prince Rivers. You have heard of the 54th Massachusetts, right? Denzel Washington, Matthew Broderick. The thing about the 54th Massachusetts that you have to understand, there are 2 things wrong with the movie. I love the movie. There are 2 things wrong with it. One, it supposes that the question was ever, if I give a black man a gun, will he fight? Oh, dear God. In the white mind of 1861, the question was, if I give a black man a gun, will he ever put it down? That's the question. The second question, the 54th Massachusetts is made up almost entirely of freed black people from the North. Whites in the Lincoln administration were like, well, we know those folks, but isn't it another matter altogether to take people who were recently enslaved days ago, in Prince Rivers' case, give them a gun, give them a uniform, and point them to fight? It's the most radical, we don't appreciate it, it's the most radical thing this country has ever done. It's a federally sponsored slave insurrection. That's what's happening. The 54th Massachusetts, Battery Wagner, that isn't what formed the United States Colored Troops. That wasn't the pivotal moment, because that wasn't the question, will they fight? The question is, will they exercise restraint when they have their foot, on the neck of their former enslavers? Will they twist, or will they show mercy? That was the question. We don't know this story, but the 1st South Carolina didn't fight at Gettysburg, didn't fight at Antietam, didn't fight at those stories battles, wasn't allowed to. You know where they did fight? In the marshes and in the plantations of South Georgia and North Florida. They went plantation to plantation, liberating their own families in places where they had themselves been enslaved. That's their project. That is a federally sponsored slave insurrection. They are the first black troops to engage Confederate troops, the first to beat them on the battlefield, the first to take them captive. They are the first to capture a Confederate town in Jacksonville, Florida in 1863. Slide. And listen to Lincoln, writing to Higginson, really to Rivers: "I am glad to see the accounts of your colored force at Jacksonville. The enemy will make extra efforts to destroy them," meaning black troops. "We should do the same to preserve and increase them." Right after he wrote that letter to Higginson, he forms the United States Colored Troops. It was not Battery Wagner. It was not the 54th Massachusetts. It was the 1st South Carolina. And the key was, would they show restraint? Remember, He's the highest ranking black sergeant in that regiment. The discipline comes from him. He's the color sergeant, and he's the provost marshal. The way those men disport themselves, the way that they behave, the way that they restrain themselves is all down to Rivers. What I mean to tell you is if you said there was one single man most responsible for the formation of the United States colored troops, it's Rivers, this man you never heard of. Why is that important? The United States colored troops, by the 1865, you have 180,000 black troops in the field. 37,000 of them died. That's more than 20%. They didn't even fight for as long. 13% died among white Union soldiers. They're at 20% in 2 years. And the federal strategy requires numerical superiority. Grant needs every man in the field. Slide. So what was the significance of the United States colored troops? If I say, well, Rivers did this, okay, well, what does it matter that he did this? Well, look at what Frederick Douglass is saying. Don't you understand what it means? Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his button, a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket, there's no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. That's what they're fighting for. That's what matters. If they don't form the United States colored troops, if Rivers and his men don't disport themselves the way they did, history might have taken a different turn. Look at Abraham Lincoln talking about, well, does it matter? These 180,000 black men in Union uniform, do they matter? Oh, yeah, they matter. Any different, he's yelling at somebody, basically. He's saying, don't you understand? Any different policy in regard to the colored man deprives us of his help, and this is more than we can bear. We cannot spare the 140 or 50,000 now serving us as soldiers, seamen, and laborers. Keep them, and you can save the Union. Throw it away, and the Union goes with it. There is no such thing as fighting for the Union and not fighting against slavery, because we need the formerly enslaved to fight this fight, or we lose our republic. We lose our country. That's how important Lincoln sees it to be. So the contributions made by Prince Rivers and his men in the 1st South Carolina, totally unknown, even to many of my fellow Civil War historians, is grotesque. It's terrible. It's got to change. Next slide. So what does he do then? Remember, I'm saying he's left an archive of action. All we have to do is trust that he's smart and then read what he does. What does he do next? This man of action. This man who done more to create the United States colored troops. This man whom, Higginson said is like a Black Panther. He becomes a politician in the South Carolina state legislature, and he devotes his entire time to one thing. Next slide. The formation of Aiken County. You can hardly see it there. It's in the central southwest. It's carved out of Edgefield. It's the only new county created in South Carolina during Reconstruction. So why does this man of action, who's just helped win this war for Union, for black citizenship, ultimately for the black vote, why does he go out with one of those little wheels and measure county boundary lines? Oh, because he has the coup d'oeil, the sweep of the eye. He reads politics on the ground. Where's this fight about to be? It's about to be local. What do I need to control? The big four: the sheriff, the coroner, the general of the militia, and the trial justice. Everyone in that day and age lives their life on the county level. Daryl and I were talking about this. The reason the black church is so important to black people during Reconstruction, it isn't just about spirituality, although it is that. It's a real estate problem. It's the only building they got. So it becomes a rec center, it becomes a school, it becomes a daycare, it becomes an incubator of leadership, it becomes the hub of community life because it's their building. It's a spatial problem. Multiply that power 100-fold if you control a county. If you control the coroner, the sheriff, the trial justice, and the general of the militia, and Rivers is all for. Once he creates Aiken County, he's like, see you later to the state legislature. And he goes, next slide, to become the mayor of Hamburg, also known as the Black Prince. Remember, they had said that if there ever was to be a black monarchy in South Carolina, he will be its king. He became the Black Prince, the power of Aiken County. He sets it at Hamburg, which is directly across the river from Augusta, Georgia, and there he presides for 10 years over a functioning interracial democracy. Hamburg is 80% black, 20% white, 100% happy. Interracial democracy is working 100 years before the Civil Rights Movement under the Black Prince. This is one of the most unsung, underappreciated experiments in interracial democracy in the history of the United States. It's all working. Until. Slide. Oh, I should quickly say this breaks my heart. This is a plat map of Hamburg, South Carolina, and you can't see because it's kind of cut off. At the very bottom it says property of Prince Rivers. This is his dream. He's mayor of this town. He's helping sell real estate to black businesses. He's building a sanctuary city for his people, and it's working. He owns some of these properties as well, but you can see him, right? He has this map on his desk, and he has this dream of a world that might be, that he built 100 years ago. Next slide. I won't dwell on July 4, 1876. Two white boys in a wagon drive up. The militia from Hamburg is marching beautifully, happily. They've read the Declaration of Independence. They've read the history of Hamburg as a town, and now they're having a parade. The white boys demand to drive through. There's a small altercation. They come back the next day. They want Prince Rivers, as trial justice, to swear out arrest warrants for his militiamen for obstructing a public road. Rivers knows where this is going. On July 8th, white men come back, this time from Augusta. They roll a tank over that bridge. All of the militiamen are holed up in the militia building. They use a cannon to blow the door off of that building. They capture some of the men, cart them down into the dead ring, as it was called. Charles Attaway, lieutenant in the militia, was among those in the dead ring. He turned to one of his fellows sitting in the ring. Mays, what do you think of this? He asked Jack Mays, who'd been a cook for the Union Army, now by all accounts ran a gambling operation in Hamburg. I don't know, Attaway, what to think of it, Mays responded. Do you think they will kill any of us? Yes, I do. I think so, just so, said Mays. Do you think they will kill me? Attaway asked finally. I do, said Mays. All you've got to do now is to pray to God to save your soul. Just give up your wife and children and everything else, for they are going to kill you. With that, Attaway hung his head and commenced crying. Next slide. But what do you do the next day? What does Prince Rivers do the next day? He convenes a coroner's inquest. That's the first link in the chain of justice. What does it mean to control a county? What does it mean to control the bureaucracy? What does it mean to control the levers of power? That's why he did this. That's why he controls Aiken County, so that he can convene a coroner's inquest, which is exactly what he does. And when the inquest is over, he bundles together the pages of testimony and he issues arrest warrants for 87 white men, including Matthew Butler, a future South Carolina senator, and Ben Tillman, a future South Carolina governor. That inquest runs in the New York Times. That is the official law of the land by the duly elected, democratically elected power in Aiken County. Now, we know the judicial process went no farther. Reconstruction was rolling back. Next slide. So what happens? In 1916, a marker was erected to the lone white man killed in the Hamburg massacre. On this pillar, it says, in life he exemplified the highest ideal of Anglo-Saxon civilization. By his death, he assured to the children of his beloved land the supremacy of that ideal. McKee Merriweather, the subject of this monument, had during the massacre said that if those boys don't come out of that building, he was going to go up to heaven and basically shoot Jesus Christ himself. I don't think that man had an easy afterlife. Let me just put it that way. After they dedicated this monument in 1916, not a joke, they screened Birth of a Nation. Okay, and so what happened to Hamburg, this sanctuary city that Rivers had created? Next slide. 1877, in South Carolina, Reconstruction is rolling back. The state has been redeemed, meaning white Democrats are now back in control of South Carolina. What's the first thing they do? Nobody pays attention to this. They revoke Hamburg's charter? Why that first? Why is that priority one? It's a perverse measure of Rivers' power. They know what that place was, right? The enemy often recognizes where the power is. Even if you don't have black records, read who the white people are scared of. Then you have a measure of who's got the juice. And in the case of South Carolina, it was without question Rivers. So in 1877, the new state legislature revokes the town's charter. In 1911, the Savannah River flooded, devastating what was left of the town. That flood also overwashed Augusta. Augusta had the financial resources and federal pull to reinforce its levees. Hamburg did not. Another flood comes in 1929. Hamburg washes away. What I need you to see is how much heritable black wealth is in what is now North Augusta, right? All of this was land they bought, they owned. And because, I think there's a class action lawsuit waiting to happen here because of illegal activity and federal malfeasance, that land fell from their care. So what is it now? We're putting, slide. We're putting on these people's graves. I'm not sure that they know exactly what this place used to be. Slide. It's very well appointed, wide streets. Slide. Fantastic homes. Slide. But this is the execution site, the site of the dead ring where Attaway and Mays and others were killed, and that road that's running over the execution site, slide, is the Jefferson Davis Memorial Highway. So that's why I call it the lost city of Hamburg. This place is lost, I think, in three ways. It mostly doesn't exist, isn't remembered. What's left is lost, has lost its way in history, in its own spirit. But Hamburg also represents a lost possibility, something that almost was a functioning interracial democracy 100 years before the Civil Rights Movement. So, slide, what happens to Rivers? Well, to his dismay, there were no more links in the chain of justice. He told his son Joshua, who was then interviewed by the WPA, now it'll be 100 years. Remember what I said about Rivers and his theory of time. Darwin was wrong. Time does not proceed gradually. Things do not change gradually. They proceed by punctuated equilibria. That is, every once in a while, time becomes elastic, the impossible becomes possible, then probable, then inevitable, and then time locks down again. Rivers could feel the wheel of time locking down into Jim Crow, into the nadir of racial relations in the United States. He knew what was coming. He had a theory of time, of when you throw your shoulder to the wheel. And that's exactly what he had done. So what happened to him? With no other options, he returned to the carriage. So imagine the arc of this remarkable man's life. Carriage driver, soldier, legislator, mayor, carriage driver again. Again, driving other people to their destinies, right? It is an arc that represents the opening and closing of a window of opportunity on a whole generation of remarkable African Americans. Rivers never sought our pity. He sought a country worthy of his name. He sought to build a better world. Amid the calls for #resistance, sanctuary cities, and a third Reconstruction, we would do well to remember a forgotten leader of the first resistance and the first Reconstruction, the original Black Panther, the man who spoke for the choked voice of a race at last unloosed when he ordered his men to arms. This is our time. So slide, if this is our time, what do we do? Get rid of this. What else do we do? Slide. Get rid of that. But what else can we do? Next slide. Remember this man. That's what Carter Woodson would have wanted, right? He would have wanted us to tell these stories of these men who became more than they thought they could ever be. I call him the original Black Panther not just because he was constantly being compared to a Black Panther, although that is true. But think about what he did. He created a sanctuary for his people in some of the most unfriendly terrain possible. That's Wakanda. He was the original Black Panther. So we should write a graphic history about him. Slide. Which I am. And we should also, slide, make a movie about him. And we should also, slide, put him on a stamp. And what I'm here to tell you is that these things will happen. So why? How can I know that this man, I call him the most consequential American about whom Americans know nothing? How can I be so confident that relatively tomorrow, everyone will know his name? First, he lived a remarkable life. But it's not just that. There are structures at work here. So next slide. If you'll permit me for just a second, this will be a bit of a diversion, but it will make sense. So when it comes to our spiritual religion, Americans are monotheistic. We have one God, one united Godhead. When it comes to our civil religion, we are polytheistic. We constellate our Godhead. So the founding fathers, for instance, are what chemists call a stable compound. I call them the X-Men of the Revolution. Each one of them has a different superpower. Hamilton codes for fiscal matters, you know. Benjamin Franklin is Yankee ingenuity and the American dream. Washington codes for Republican power. Once upon a time, Thomas Jefferson was sort of the Renaissance man. Nobody is going to break into that circle. It is a stable compound. They complete each other. Next slide. So do these. This is the American Renaissance. Melville, Emerson, Whitman, Thoreau, Poe, Dickinson, Locke. No one else is making it in. They complete each other. Walt Whitman is barbaric yawping off of every rooftop, and Edgar Allan Poe is mumbling in the loony bin. But they complete each other, right? It's American optimism meets cynicism, meets realism, meets pragmatism. They complete each other. Next slide. This is not yet a stable compound. The first generation of African American freedom fighters is still auditioning for its Godhead. These folks will make it. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, without question. They are in the pantheon of gods. But what I notice, every one of them went north and had their story told. Not one of them remained all their lives in the South, fighting for blacks in the South every day of their lives. That slot is what we're auditioning for. That slot is what someone needs to take. Who could it be? Hit the slide. Well, I guess there's some possibility it could be, John Henry. The problem is John Henry wasn't a freedom fighter exactly. He codes more for fighting against capitalism, right? Fighting for the individual more than really a fighter for his entire race. Next, Nat Turner. I think it's going to be a little while before this guy is on a stamp. I got to be honest with you. And so next slide. You can just hit one more. There's a problem with black masculinity, basically, in auditioning who's going to be on that, in that pantheon of gods of the early black freedom struggle. the Americans, basically, we will name, military hardware after Native Americans, an Apache helicopter, a Tomahawk missile. We will name, naval bases, army bases, after Confederate generals who tried to destroy the United States Army, and the United States Army is naming property after them. Why? Because that masculinity isn't a threat anymore. That masculinity was vanquished. Black masculinity is something else. That's still out there. That's still scary. It's going to be a long time before this country puts Nat Turner on a stamp. So, next slide. So who gets this last slot? Well, we're going to need somebody who was in the South, fought for blacks in the South for the whole of their life, but did it with restraint. Right? Hit the slide. I think it's him. This isn't what we give him. This isn't what I argue for him. This is what he made for himself out of his biography. This is what he demands from the grave. Next slide. I found this very recently. It's hard to read. It is written on the back of the only document I have in Prince River's own hand. And it is a very short note that he prepared for his colonel, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. So when Thomas Wentworth Higginson was preparing this is a white man, he's lived in Boston, he's preparing his papers for Harvard at the end of his life, and he finds this one crude letter from this one sergeant that he hasn't seen in decades. And he turns that document over and he writes, "I hope your name will never be out of the papers of the First South," meaning the history of the First South. I hope your name will never be out of the history of the First South. What was that document? I had to go back to figure out the biography of these two men. It was the last time they saw each other. Higginson was quitting the 1st South Carolina, and Rivers said, "I'll come by your tent." I don't know what those two men talked about that night, but I know they were together. I know that Higginson saved this small order, and I know that he wrote that on the back of it. So, last slide. I'm going to end with this one. For my friend, this is the cornerstone of his church, and I am so pleased and grateful that I got to be here. I believe this. Love never fails. Love will always triumph over hate. Knowledge will always triumph over ignorance. Good will always triumph over evil. So now let's go out and make Prince Rivers famous. Let's restore him to himself and to his rightful place in history. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Surely. Come to the microphone because we learned last night that they couldn't hear online. And there's a microphone on this side and a microphone on this side.
It's not really a question. You talk about Prince Rivers. It kind of reminds me of Maynard Jackson on the line. He has a foresight.
Right.
Every black person on the line that has a business is making money and a millionaire, owe it to Maynard Jackson.
Yes.
He had a foresight. The other thing I thought about when I heard you talking about that, it seemed like when we get so far, someone comes in and destroys everything we done did.
Yeah.
That's all I have to say.
Excellent points. I often think that he had the insights of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. He had all of those insights like decades before those men were even on the scene. So from W.E.B. Du Bois, he definitely sees that it's going to take a talented 10th. What it meant to that community to live in forced illiteracy, we think about the brutalities of slavery and we think about physical brutality. And that was true. It was unbelievably impossible to imagine what it would be like to be separated from your family, to be unable to protect your family, to give your son a trade, a name, an educate, all of those things. But it's the assault on the spirit, the assault on the heart, the assault on the soul, the assault on the psyche, too. That was, and so for Rivers to be literate and to be this leader, that's why, I always tell my students this, why was so much Klan violence necessary? Absolutely because they're sadists. I understand that's partly true. But why do you need that much violence? Because something's working. Wherever you see that much violence, it's because interracial democracy is taking root, is working on the ground. And Rivers knew, this is from W.E. Du Bois, that it was going to take that talented tenth because they only had so many folks. The talent pool, right, under enslavement, is very difficult to build. So that, but from Booker T. Washington, the only color that matters in this country is green, right? And so until you could, in controlling that town and in creating businesses and in creating business opportunities for black families, Rivers had the foresight, I think, of Booker T. Washington. And that's why I think he's such an important figure. A lot of it is that he's fighting on the ground in the South. These are not abstractions for him, right? He's there every day trying to figure this out. I mean, he's a bona fide genius for sure, but he's also here every day trying to figure out how he can create a sanctuary for his people. And that's what he teaches me. I keep going back to this point about it's just what he earned. I'm just getting out of his way. This guy is about to bestride the land like a colossus, and it has nothing to do with me. Essentially, it's him teaching us through an archive of action a history that has been lost to us. I didn't know you needed to control the Big Four. I didn't know the coroner, the trial justice, the general of the militia, and and the sheriff were the whip hand of slavery. I didn't know that. I didn't know that most people lived their lives on a county level. I didn't know that. He taught me that. Why did he go to the state legislature and then immediately get out of there? Because he knew the state legislature was about to be totally useless in what he was attempting to do. I got to make this and then get back on that ground fast as possible because here comes the rumble. Great question, thank you.
I don't know if this is a question or a statement, but when you see what happened to Prince Rivers and his militiamen, and you look forward in history, and you see what happened in Alabama, Oklahoma to blacks and Indians, even in Florida, when the government turns its back on incidents like that and nothing ever happens, it will continue to happen.
Yes.
Even today. So my question is, what needs to happen to start the government focusing on equal justice for everybody?
Right.
Yeah, I know we try and we talk about it, but there has to be something to ignite a movement that will make the government do what it's have promised to do, and that is equal justice for everybody.
I couldn't agree more. There's the state has to have the legitimately constituted federal authorities, state authorities, to the extent that they exist, have to have a monopoly on violence and let no one else use it, right? So the problem that we have, we think a lot about the African American community being over-policed in some ways. It's also under-policed in some ways, right? So when you have black-on-black violence, those cases too often, especially among white police departments, don't get investigated. Oh, it's gangbang, we don't have to do anything about it. No, that's somebody's child. Exactly what you're saying. Violence always begets more violence. It has to be snuffed out. And I think you're exactly right that we need a better, not just understanding, but execution on that point. And I think history teaches us that lesson as well, but it continues very much into the present.
Thank you for yielding. I'm confused. So is Hamburg Aiken, South Carolina? And how did he acquire the land? Was this swamp land? Was it something that was given to him? Was it a plantation that was burned out? Or, so how did he acquire this?
I really appreciate that question because I rushed through this. Hamburg between 1820 and 1840 is an inland cotton hub, basically for wagon traffic that's bringing cotton from upstate South Carolina to Hamburg. So you can remember, Hamburg is directly across the river from Augusta. Most of Georgia's cotton is going to Augusta, then going by the Savannah River down to Savannah. So that's how Georgia is getting its cotton to market and then off to Manchester and all these other places in England. Well, how is South Carolina doing it? Okay, it's moving it to Hamburg, and then there's a railroad that runs kind of like along the river, but it runs all the way from Hamburg to Charleston. It's the largest common carrier in the United States, longer than the B&O. So the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, we're supposed to be the largest common carrier. No, it's the Hamburg, it's the cotton, of course, that's where the money is. So this line. Well, what happens is Augusta wins this battle between these two modes of transport because of the Augusta Canal Project. And so all of a sudden it can move South Carolina's cotton, Georgia's cotton, everybody's cotton. So then what happens to Hamburg? So you've got this place that's been built up. It's an industrial center. It's depressed real estate. And this is the part that we don't appreciate about African Americans in the aftermath of Reconstruction. They don't have a lot of liquidity, right? They don't have, a lot of wealth, of course, because all of their labor has been not paid. And they're not getting 40 acres and a mule. And that was my point about why the black church is so important, because it is infrastructurally one of the only buildings that they have. But Hamburg, when Rivers pulls through Hamburg and he sees these old brick buildings still in great shape, it's like a ghost town, essentially. But he's like, here, I can build it here. We will be safe here. So it's back to the sweep of the eye. He'd known Hamburg because he's a coachman, right? So he knows virtually all of South Carolina. So he's been through that hub before. So he keeps going through Hamburg and he sees it falling more and more apart, more and more whites kind of drifting out, the economy kind of downtrodden. And he's like, I could make a Mecca here. And so again, it's that insight that he had. To your point about Aiken, Aiken is the name of the entire county. We know it has its county seat at Aiken. He made his seat at Hamburg for these reasons. So, and he was known as the Black Prince, but he's also known as the Power of Aiken County. Again, that goes back to read what whites are saying about who they think their enemy is. So if they're calling Rivers the Power of Aiken County, that gives you some hint as to how much control he had over that entire area from Hamburg. And it really must have been something in its day, right? A flourishing interracial democracy. Prince Rivers had white lawyers. He had white friends. There were people that he counted on in Hamburg, and they fell in the massacre too. They lost a lot in that massacre too. Making common cause with him. So we have to imagine, back to that question of, time becomes elastic. So do attitudes. You can't quite figure out why. Oh, it's impossible that we would ever do X or Y. People won't permit it. They can't change that fast. And suddenly they do, right? And that's what happened in this little experiment in South Carolina. That's out of Edgefield. That's the most unreconstructed country in America. Those are the most racist whites in the world. And yet somehow he created a functioning interracial democracy for 10 years that nobody's ever heard of. It's remarkable.
What can you tell us about his descendants, and are there still some there in Aiken County?
Yes. So this is a very sad story. So he and his first wife, Elsie, were married probably very young and had 12 children come to term, 10 of whom died prior to the Civil War. By the Rivers was gone a lot through the Civil War, so you can imagine he's fighting with his unit, and then they disband all of the white troops, but they keep the black troops even through 1866. So, but by the time he gets home, that marriage is just frayed under the weight of accumulated tragedies, having lost so many children, and just the distance. So there are some descendants from that, and then he marries a second wife. She's much younger. They don't actually have any children, but he was an epic Lothario, I will tell you. And so there are rivers running all over the place, some in Aiken, but mostly back in Beaufort. You have to imagine that when we talk about the Battle of Port Royal, November 1861, and rivers being the first of the first of the first, well, that's because Reconstruction begins wherever the Federal Army takes control of any piece of the South. That doesn't happen anywhere earlier than the Penn Center, or where the now Obama dedicated the National Aero Reconstruction Park, right? And so Reconstruction starts in 1861. Rivers is part of that experiment. And so Reconstruction might have gone a very, very different way if it had followed on the Beaufort model in St. Helena. But anyway, that's where most of his people are.
I basically rise to take my seat. That was my question.
Oh, okay. You know, he's buried actually in Columbia, South Carolina. We know we have Gospel Pilgrim here, that in the 1880s there was a movement to create spaces where African Americans could finally not be bothered and could be buried and not moved. And so, unfortunately, the cemetery, Randolph Cemetery in Columbia, South Carolina, is where he is buried, but his stone is no longer there. We haven't been able to find it.
How many people got hung at the bridge?
Oh, so there were 7 men that were murdered in the Hamburg massacre. I should say McKee Merriweather, the individual white, we don't know that he wasn't shot by crossfire, meaning by other whites. We're not exactly sure about that. There is a marker that was set finally, I mean, very relatively recently, for the victims of the Hamburg massacre. It was then torn down, and but I think that they have put that back up now. But if you go there, there's no real sense of what this once was, what was on this land once. Again, I think it was probably one of the most inspiring and functional interracial democracies in the history of Reconstruction. And even my own colleagues know incredibly little about it.
So, the people that were found guilty, you showed us that slide with
Yeah.
the coroner's information.
Yeah.
You said they went on to become senators and governors.
Yep.
So, did they ever serve any time, or was that just wipes clean with the getting rid of the charge?
Absolutely. So, of course, Pitchfork Ben Tillman becomes one of the most legendarily racist governors in South Carolina's history and is openly bragging about his participation in the Hamburg massacre. Matthew Butler also becomes a South Carolina senator. And what I mean, back to this idea, theory of time, and this is what Rivers taught me too. I didn't think about it this way. I'm a historian, but I didn't think about time this way. But he sees it. He sees the wheels, the gears, starting to align in a way where it's like, if I push right here, right now, I can move the wheel of time. And that possibility will close down. And then it won't budge. I could break my head against this thing and it will not move. And to answer your question, that's exactly what happens. So after Reconstruction rolls back, these men are sitting in the Senate. Their Northern colleagues know what they've done, not just kind of with an order or a piece of paper, but literally with their own hands, committed murder. That we have a duly appointed coroner, a duly appointed trial justice, screaming for justice. And there they sit in the Senate. Because again, time becomes inelastic, and what happens to race relations in this country at the depth of Jim Crow, you know, you go from 90% of blacks voting to 0 in roughly 10 years. It's very sudden. And again, I go back to him telling his son Joshua, now it'll be 100 years. Okay, maybe that's a tossed off comment. It was 100 years. We call the civil rights movement the second Reconstruction. There's 100 years between the two. He was right to the decade. That's how good his sense of how history works is. He's a fantastic historian. I find his mind, once I dedicated myself to, he's probably right, definitely knows what he's doing, certainly knows more than me. So all I have to do is figure out the context in which he made those decisions, and I'll know everything about the time, the lay of the land in which he made them. I really enjoyed getting to tell you something about Prince Rivers' story. Thank you very much.
Before you go, he has a wealth of information and a love for Lincoln. You mentioned early on one of the early slides that Lincoln recognized the centrality and the importance of the U.S. colored troops. What can you tell us about Lincoln? Certainly the importance of Prince Rivers and those who fought. What can you share with us about how Lincoln fought for black rights?
So one of the things that I think you have to understand about Lincoln, like any man, grows. And some people grow smaller as they age, crabbier, right? Tighter-fisted, tighter-minded. Lincoln's heart opened, Lincoln's mind opened a lot in office. We don't really appreciate this, but the very last speech that he gave, that his assassin heard, was a speech about how we have to extend the vote. We're years from the 15th Amendment. We're days after the Civil War. And John Wilkes Booth hears this. He says, well, then that means Negro citizenship. By God, I'll put him through. So Lincoln is a martyr for his commitment to a forward-looking version of American citizenship that embraces black and white alike and embraces the vote. But I won't deny that, you know, you read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and Lincoln is very strange on race. You know, it's like Douglas is a stone-cold racist. He's playing the race card continuously, and Lincoln is, you know, trying to outmaneuver. So he'll do things like, of course, you know, we're not equal. We're not the same color, ha, ha, ha. You know, or he has one where you keep talking about, you know, he's talking to Douglas, you keep talking about miscegenation. I guess, you know, if you want to have an interracial relationship, and you're so concerned or preoccupied about it, I guess you should just go ahead if she can stand it. Meaning if the black woman can stand it. And so that's a degree of empathy, I think, in putting himself in the black woman's shoes and supposing why would she ever want this idiot Douglas anyway. So, but he's never forceful because he's a politician and he can't be elected. But once he has the power, he uses the power, I think. And when I mean when I say when he forms the United States Colored Troops, That is a radical thing that he is doing. When we think of them as just sort of helping, maybe they're, doing labor or they are doing garrison work, but they're not at Gettysburg or they're not at Antietam. When I tell you they're in North Florida liberating plantations, that puts a very different spin on what it is that they're doing. These are plantations on which some of them had themselves been enslaved and on which their families are still enslaved. That's Django Unchained, So when I think Lincoln never became quite a radical, but he was constantly evolving. And I think he would have continued to evolve if he hadn't been assassinated. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Are there any other last-minute questions? I just want to say to you, thank you so much. I know your schedule is hectic. We're well underway in the semester, but we're so appreciative of you coming by to introduce us to Prince Rivers. My brothers and sisters, God bless you. Thank you for coming out for night number 2. Just a couple of announcements. Remember, tomorrow night is Dr. Sandy Martin from the Religion Department, and he's going to be talking about the Black church in Black history, the centrality and the importance of the Black church. For all of the brothers here, remember Friday night, we have the all-male worship service. There'll be churches here from Morgan County, from Walton County, and I think now from Elbert County, and certainly those from Clark County. So we look forward to seeing everybody come back tonight. Those who are watching online, thank you so much. We hope you did learn something tonight, and Google Prince Rivers. Have a good night.